Hi, I'm Tim Story with NCSL. I'm here with noted historian Jon Meacham, who is here to give a presentation to the National Conference of State Legislatures.
Shed light, we call it.
He's going to shed, that's
Yeah,
right. Pearls before swine would be another way to say. We'll be the swine, you be the pearls. And so we're really excited. We truly are. You did a tremendous job in New York. It was sort of popular acclaim, and I know you do this a lot, but you calibrated it just right for our state legislator audience and our state folks. So we're really excited that you're here.
Thank you.
NCSL, this is our annual convention. We have about 5,000 total people at the conference, about close to 950, 1,000 state legislators, all 50 states, both parties, about 900 legislative staff who have attended. So I don't know how many will be at this session. It's the last session. A lot of people are getting flights back to the East Coast. But So I think they're really interested in hearing from someone who's thought a lot about the political history of this nature and some of the great leaders of this country. So I'd like to start with Thomas Jefferson. Sort of start at where we've been not so recently, but not so long ago. What can state legislators today, elected officials today, learn from Thomas Jefferson and how he used power to accomplish great things?
Well, I think that's the answer. I think that Jefferson is often seen as a philosopher, an architect, some sort of a figure above politics in many ways. And in many senses, he wanted to be seen that way. He wanted to be seen as the father of the University of Virginia and the author of the Declaration and the author of the Virginia Bill for Religious Liberty. But for 40 years, from 1769 until he left the White House in 1809, he was a practicing politician. He sought office, he held office, he pretended he didn't want office. All the themes that continue to unfold in our political life. But he understood that however philosophically attuned he was to the culture and currents of his time, that if you were simply philosophical, that put you in a different category. You had less impact. You foreclosed the possibilities to put those ideas into wide action. And so he represented, I think, a kind of ideal American figure who was attuned to the big ideas of the age, which were the biggest ideas. It was the whole transformation of the idea of human liberty that was going on in the West at that time. And in many ways, the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution were the political manifestation of this fundamental shift from the focus on the king to the focus on the individual. So his openness to those ideas married to his ability to amass power, hold on to it, exercise it in a real cut and thrust, everyday legislative arena was what made him truly great.
Could he get elected today in our current political landscape?
Well, he got elected then, and it was different, but it was a difference, I think, of degree, not of kind. Remember, Jefferson and Adams ran in the first contested presidential election, 1796. You could have the negative ads at the time for Adams. It was not a super PAC. I think it was actually probably more clearly allied. Was you could have God and Adams or Jefferson and no God. So for those of us who think that either Fox or MSNBC created this has gone on a long time. His temperament was such that he would have a very hard time with the hyper-criticism of the moment. He would read all the Twitter feeds about him, and it would drive him crazy. But remember then, having a newspaper that came every month or every couple of months was an information superhighway. So everything's a matter of context. When you really, really read Jefferson's letters and think about him, he was probably too thin-skinned for his chosen profession. I suspect some of your members may have something in common with that. But it's one of the reasons I admire politicians so much is just their capacity to get in the arena, put up with people kicking them in the shins just for the hell of it. I have a hard time imagining what life must be like if every second person you meet probably voted against you. Right? If you're an American president in these days, George H.W. Bush won 53.5% in 1988. That's the biggest margin in recent times. But that means that almost every second person he met did not want him to be doing the job he was doing. That has a certain psychological toll that I think we're perhaps observers are not always as aware of as we should be.
So you've turned your attention to George H.W. Bush.
That's right.
Book coming out very soon on that.
Yep.
When is it?
November.
In November. I assume you're about to do a lot of promotion and talk to a lot of people,
bit,
so
yeah.
you're well versed and you've been immersed in it for a while. What will surprise us about George H.W. Bush when we start to learn more about him?
Well, he was the last gentleman in American public life.
Wait, do you say that with a period? He was the last. There will be no more gentlemen.
I hope there'll be more.
Okay.
But right now, and in fact, President Obama. I interviewed him about him, and he went right to that. He said, when I opposed him, when I was a young man when he was president, but I found him to be incredibly gracious and incredibly gentlemanly. He's the last of a kind. The last president of the World War II generation, the first president of the post-Cold War era, the last president to make a decided choice to go contrary to his own political interest when he broke his No New Taxes pledge in 1990. He came of age politically in the 1960s in the House when it was much clubbier, much more compromised. Here's a fun statistic. He served 4 years in the House, 2 years under Lyndon Johnson, 2 years under Richard Nixon. He voted with Lyndon Johnson about 52% of the time. He voted with Richard Nixon 53.5% of the time. He called them as he saw them and was a creature in many ways of the middle, which is a very, very narrow strip of land right now and has gotten ever more narrow. But when you think about a man who signed up on his 18th birthday to become a naval aviator, was shot down out of the sky at 20, lost 2 of his crewmates, went through Yale in 2.5 years, built a business, started running for office in 1964, lost 2 Senate races, lost a presidential race, but just kept going. And it's a story of great public service, but also ferocious ambition. This was one of the most competitive men who ever drew breath, and he hides it brilliantly, but it was always an effort to hide it. One of the fun things about doing biography is you get to read everybody's old report cards, and his high school report cards, his teachers' comments are wonderfully prescient. He gets so intense over everything. He worries too much. He tries to hide it and be cool, but you can tell he's really worried. That's a theme that runs throughout. So he's a great man. He's really a giant of 20th century history, and he deserves a moment on the stage by himself. At a certain point, King David was just King David. He wasn't a precursor, and so this is a book about him, not about his sons.
But there's an implication in your answer that people of his ilk, of that gentlemanliness, of voting as much with a Democratic president as a Republican president, that has somehow become, at least for the time, archaic.
It is archaic.
And so why is that? And what can history tell us about how we move beyond this time of gridlock in Washington, gridlock between Washington and the states?
It requires, is a great question. I think 3 things happened, and they all happened more or less on his watch, and they were a little bit beyond his control. One was this rise of reflexive partisanship. The idea that a House Republican caucus would be more interested in a House majority than in the success of a Republican president. And if you talk to Newt Gingrich and you talk to Vin Weber, they're pretty honest about their goal was to break the 40-year lock of the Democrats on the House, and George Bush was not helping them do that. And so they made the decision they made. That was totally beyond George Bush's life experience, that a Republican caucus would turn on a Republican president for its own partisan ends within that. So it was the rise of reflexive partisanship was one. The other was the rise of, pre-digital, but the rise of cable news. The commentariat became more constant, more constantly available from '89 to '93. You had had Capital Gang. You had the beginning of the world we know now, and politics became more like a sports event. And so you have an incessant chatter. And the third thing I think that changed, which Bill Clinton is the apotheosis of, is this idea of confessional politics, that he would feel your pain. George H.W. Bush is one of the most sensitive men I've ever known. He's cried in my presence over a number of issues. You talk to anyone who knows him well, but he would never do that in public. He just thought that the presidency itself required a different level of dignity. There's a wonderful story when he was vice president in Krakow. He's gone to a children's leukemia ward. His daughter died of leukemia in 1953. And the cameras are behind him. And he's standing there, and he suddenly realizes where he is. And he starts to cry. But he won't turn around, because if he turns around, that makes the story about him, not about the kids. So he stands there until he pulls it together. And with due respect to his successors in the political arena, I don't know many political figures who would have that complex a series of thoughts to preserve both the dignity of his current office and the feelings and the attention that should be on the children. And so I think he's a remarkable man. Far from perfect, made a lot of mistakes, but in him we see a hell of a lot of the 20th and 21st centuries. You know, he first ran for office for county chairman in 1962, so it's been more than 50 years. And only man since John Adams to see his son become president. Only president since John Adams. And the story's not over yet.
You don't run across too many perfect men, I guess, in your business. Right?
Not enough, not enough. And when we do, it'll be a shorter book.
That's right. So the gridlock that's going on in Washington, you know, state legislative leaders, people in the states who have to balance their budgets, who have to sort of work together,
Yeah.
Limited session lengths, that kind of thing. They look at Washington and say, you know, it's a disaster, just choose your metaphor of apocalypse and
right.
insert it.
The Walking Dead.
Yeah, it seems that sometimes. All of them fit, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, put that in historic context. Do we overblow this polarized gridlock nature? Or do you think we are at some sort of moment that it surpasses?
It's worse than it's been in a long time. Is it 1850s bad? I think maybe statistically you could argue that. I'm a little skeptical of that particular idea. I think it is like the 30s. I think you do have a, no matter who is president, because I'm not casting partisan aspersions here, I think you have an ideology of opposition that has become reflexive and total. And people are willing to wait longer, I mean, to just stall until there can be a shift, than, at least then it felt as though, particularly, you know, I would argue that though no president or no governor, I suspect, would say that, oh, they always got what they want, I do think you had more cooperation in the 50s and early part of the 60s than you do now. And part of the issue there is you're never going to get 100%. You're not supposed to. But you should be able to get 2 or 3 big votes every once in a while. And on foreign policy, you know, you should be able to get at least more of a tone of cooperation than we've seen lately. What happened? Why is it happening? I think it's this idea of free agency. I think that parties have, interestingly, party gridlock has never, you know, has rarely been so strong, and yet party has rarely mattered so little in terms of, you know, your loyalty up. So you have a donor class that is arguably more important than the old traditional party structure. You know, the proliferation of money has an insidious effect, if not an explicit one. And so I'm not quite sure what changes it. What always changes it on the margins, what always has changed it on the margins, is truly great executive leadership. So, when you have a Ronald Reagan or you have a Lyndon Johnson in 64, 65, you get someone who, A, respects the legislative side, works it very hard, and tends to get a couple of big things. And that's an important point, is getting a couple of big things is as good as it's going to get. One of my favorite ways to put expectations in context is President Johnson, who was seen as the greatest legislative president probably of the 20th century, right? He had about 1,000 days between the 64 landslide and the 66 backlash. And so he got the Voting Rights Act, he got a lot of the Great Society legislation, but what happens in 66 after he destroys Goldwater? Reagan becomes governor of California, the Republicans win a ton of seats, and it sets up 1968 and Nixon. So even Lyndon Johnson had about 1,000 days. And it's why I think that, presidents have to strike early and fast. And I think historically, for what it's worth, I think that President Obama will end up being tasked to some extent for 09 and 10 for not moving faster and more boldly, I think.
It's a great lesson. I mean, so I want to capture that. You seem to apply that the path out of the fever is a great leader coming forward.
Yeah.
I mean, is that too simplistic, or is that sort of where you're going with
No,
that?
because these are all human interactions, right? So they're huge market forces, they're impersonal forces, all of that. But if you look at things historically, it's always a great executive leader and cooperative legislative leaders who are willing to trust the executive on a couple of big things. And if you don't have those ingredients in the cocktail, then you're not going to have a cocktail.
We'll end on leadership a little bit. Everybody, there's this desperate, I think, sort of desire for leaders to step forward at all levels.
Right.
And there are plenty of people out there with that capacity. What do you advise them to do to become great leaders? That's a very big question.
Yeah.
But one, is there a book you'd tell them to read that's not one of your own? Is there?
Sure.
And what would they take from that? Maybe that's a better way to frame it.
That's a great question.
What would you direct them to?
That's a great question. I think patience is, and it's one of the reasons I would be a terrible politician. I think that the greatest leaders have had a capacity for personal patience that is genuinely remarkable. Let's look at Ronald Reagan. All right, so he really starts his public life in the 50s and is elected in 1980. Ran 3 times, was able to hone his ideas, work on his ideas, read all the time. Didn't always, they wouldn't always pass the sternest fact check, but that's all right.
He would be the first person.
Exactly.
That.
George H.W. Bush, again, went from losing a Senate seat to being UN ambassador, chairman of the Republican National Committee, ambassador to China, director of the CIA, vice president. That all now looks as this wonderful march of a resume to be president. He was fighting for each of those jobs along the way. He was patient along the way. In terms of what to read, I think great political leaders, Thomas Jefferson, FDR, Eisenhower, Reagan certainly, were always in tune with the cultural currents of the time. And so not just understanding the internet as a communications tool, but really what is everybody else reading? Read what's on the bestseller list. You need to be where your people are in many ways. And, I don't think you can know too much history. Harry Truman once said, the only new thing in the world is the history you don't know.
That's an island that's getting bigger.
Exactly.
The more you learn, right? The more
Right.
You learn,
Yeah,
the tougher
exactly.
it gets.
Exactly.
Well, that's true. What about history today? The state of the teaching of history and the learning of history.
Well, yeah, I'm very old-fashioned about this, perhaps unsurprisingly. I think learning the dates and learning the facts is essential because you can't make sense of what you don't know. It's hard to be creative if you don't have torture that metaphor. You can't build a castle if you don't have the bricks. You know, whatever you want to do. And so I'm very much for a fairly straightforward base to build a base of it for it. It's, you know, we always read those depressing polls that come out every year. You know, more people know, you know, that Alex Rodriguez did X or Y than we have a Supreme Court.
One of the Kardashians.
Right, yeah, the Kardashians versus the Constitution. You know, it's not a fair fight. So that's always problematic, but that's a family thing. I mean, I think it's the schools, but it's you know, I remember when Bill Bennett did the Book of Virtues, huge bestseller, and it shows there's an enormous hunger for having that conversation. History, you know, I think the contemporary use of history, at least in my mind, is not as an antidepressant. I mean, it's not that, you know, you take it and therefore you feel better about everything that's going on, but it is a diagnostic tool. I mean, it does give you the capacity to judge how worried you really should be about problem X or problem Y of the current moment. So if you know about William Jennings Bryan and Henry Wallace and Ross Perot, then maybe Donald Trump, you know, maybe that sort of helps you put him in context. You know, is he Ross Perot? You know, is this as important as some of the progressive third-party movements? You know, is this a populist uprising of the left, or is this like what Richard Hofstadter wrote, you know, the paranoid style in American politics? Is it nativist? Is it populist? I mean, just, you can't answer the question if you don't have the tools. And so knowing what happened in that sense at least gives you the capacity to assess, you know, how much should we freak out?
The classic cliche closer, anything else you'd say to state legislators? And
stay in the fight. Stay in the fight. I mean, it's so important. I live in Tennessee, and it's having a good run of things right now. But you know, it's hard, and I know it's hard to run these campaigns, and you know, and now because of technology and because of money, you never know when somebody in Washington's going to decide that your district should go, and sometimes you might not even see it coming. Right? I mean, when I talk to friends, more at the federal level, they live in absolute terror of, and I use that phrase wisely, you know, will they get primaried in a way? But it's, you know, I grew up in a quasi-political family. I grew up around state, you know, legislators and senators, and you know, they want to leave things better than they found it, and so God bless them.
that's terrific. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim.